Jim LeBlanc almost died in a room the size of a living room, not in space, not on a mission. In a test chamber at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas in 1966, on a Tuesday morning, while a group of engineers sat behind glass and watched their instruments and made notes. He was wearing a spacesuit. The suit was connected to a pressurized air supply through a hose. And then, the hose came loose. And in the next few seconds, Jim LeBlanc experienced something that no human being was ever supposed to experience and survive. This is that story. To understand what happened to him, you have to understand what a spacesuit actually is. Most people think of it as a costume, a big white puffy outfit that astronauts wear because space looks cold. It is not a costume, it is a personal spacecraft. Everything your body needs to stay alive, pressure, oxygen, temperature regulation, the suit provides all of it the moment you step outside a vehicle into vacuum. Without it, you do not freeze first or suffocate first. What kills you first is the pressure, or rather, the absence of it. Here on Earth, the atmosphere pushes down on you at about 14.7 pounds per square inch. You have never felt it because you have always lived inside it, and your body developed to exist inside it, and everything is balanced. Your blood, your tissues, the fluid in your joints, all of it is calibrated for that pressure. The moment that pressure drops, things start going wrong very fast. The dissolved gases in your blood begin to form bubbles, the same way a bottle of soda fizzes when you open it and release the pressure. Your saliva boils, not because it is hot. It boils at body temperature in a vacuum because boiling is just what happens to liquid when there is not enough pressure to hold it together. Your lungs, if they contain air, will rupture if you try to hold your breath. The correct thing to do is exhale and keep exhaling, which is not a natural instinct when you feel like you are suffocating. You lose consciousness in about 15 seconds. After that, your body has maybe another minute or two before the damage becomes irreversible. Jim LeBlanc knew all of this. He was a trained test subject, working with NASA engineers to evaluate spacesuit designs. And part of that work involved getting into the suits and getting into the vacuum chamber and letting the engineers pump the air out, and then doing things. Moving around, testing the joints, checking that the suit held pressure, while the instruments recorded everything. It was careful work, methodical, the kind of work where nothing goes wrong because everyone has thought very hard about all the ways things could go wrong and designed against them. On that morning in 1966, the chamber was taken down to near vacuum. LeBlanc was going through his procedures, and then the hose connecting his suit to the external air supply developed a leak. The pressure inside his suit began to drop. He felt it immediately, a strange sensation in his mouth, on his tongue, the saliva beginning to bubble and froth at body temperature. He had just enough time to register what was happening and say something into his radio before he lost consciousness. The engineers behind the glass saw him go down. They began repressurizing the chamber immediately. The whole sequence from hose failure to LeBlanc losing consciousness took about 15 seconds, which is exactly how long the textbook said it would take. He woke up on the floor of the chamber as the pressure came back. He had a pain in his ears. He was confused for a moment, and then he was fine. Not fine in the way people say fine when they mean fine enough, actually fine. Back on his feet within minutes, coherent, no lasting damage. The repressurization had happened fast enough that the 15 seconds of vacuum exposure had not crossed the threshold into permanent injury. He was the first and so far only person to experience near vacuum exposure and survive to describe it. And what he described was not what most people expect. No explosion, no blood, no cinematic horror, just the strange sensation of his own saliva boiling on his tongue, and then nothing, and then the floor. The reason his account matters so much is that before it, almost everything NASA knew about human exposure to vacuum was theoretical. They had animal experiments, they had models, they had calculated the timelines, but they had never had a human being come back from it and say, here is what it actually felt like. LeBlanc's 15 seconds became one of the most referenced data points in the history of spacesuit design. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. A person had been there and come back. What it taught engineers was that the margin is tighter than anyone is comfortable with. 15 seconds to unconsciousness is not a long time. In a real emergency in space, 15 seconds is almost nothing. You cannot fix a hose leak in 15 seconds. You cannot get back inside an airlock in 15 seconds. You cannot do much of anything in 15 seconds except possibly shout something into a radio and then fall down. The suit is the only thing standing between an astronaut and that 15-second clock, and so the suit has to be treated as the most important piece of equipment on any mission, which sounds obvious but has not always been how it was treated. Because the suits are old, genuinely embarrassingly old. The suits NASA used for spacewalks on the International Space Station, for most of its operational history, were designed in the 1970s, not updated in the 1970s, designed in the 1970s. The EMU, the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, first flew in 1982, and the basic design has not changed since. Engineers have replaced components, added systems, done what they can to keep the suits operational. But the fundamental architecture is 50 years old, and it shows. In 2013, an Italian astronaut named Luca Parmitano was doing a spacewalk outside the station when he noticed water inside his helmet. Not a little water. Water accumulating around his ears, then rising toward his eyes and nose and mouth. His cooling system had developed a fault and was leaking water into the suit. Water in a spacesuit helmet in the vacuum of space is one of the worst things that can happen, because water does not behave like air. It does not drift away. It coats surfaces. It floats in blobs. And in a helmet, it floats toward your face because that is where the airflow goes, and it gets in your nose and your eyes, and eventually it can drown you. Parmitano was outside the station, tethered, moving back toward the airlock, unable to communicate clearly because the water was covering his ears, unable to see well because it was in his eyes, navigating by memory and feel in the dark side of the orbit where there is no sunlight. He made it back inside. The fault was eventually traced to a contamination issue that clogged a filter that should have prevented exactly this from happening. 2 years later, another astronaut had the same problem, same suit design, same basic fault. The filter had been redesigned after Parmitano's incident. The redesign was not enough. These are not freak accidents. They are what happens when you rely on 50-year-old technology in an environment that has no tolerance for failure. The suit either works or you have 15 seconds. What most people do not know is how close the spacesuit situation has come to grounding human spaceflight entirely. By the early 2020s, NASA was running out of functioning EMU suits. They were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The agency was dependent on a small number of suits that were aging, increasingly difficult to maintain, and designed for a station that orbits at a relatively low altitude rather than for the deep space missions NASA was planning. The suits that Artemis astronauts need for walking on the moon are a completely different problem from the suits that work for low Earth orbit, and for years, the development of those suits was behind schedule, over budget, and producing results that independent evaluators described in terms that should have made headlines, but mostly did not. The pressure system has to work. The temperature regulation has to work. The joints have to move correctly, because if a joint stiffens in the wrong position in a pressurized suit, you cannot force it, and you cannot fix it outside. The communications have to work. The oxygen supply has to work. Everything has to work every single time, because there is no repair shop on the lunar surface, and there is no one to call, and the clock starts at 15 seconds. Jim LeBlanc survived because the engineers behind the glass reacted immediately, and the chamber repressurized in time, and his body was young and healthy, and absorbed the insult of 15 seconds in near vacuum without lasting damage. That combination of factors came together in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment. Change one of them. Slower reaction, older body, slightly longer exposure, slightly lower pressure, and the story ends differently, and nobody outside of NASA ever hears his name. He gave interviews about it years later, when he was older, when the incident had become part of the historical record of the space program. He was matter-of-fact about it. He described the sensation. He said it was not as bad as he might have expected. He said the saliva boiling on his tongue was the strangest part. He did not describe it as terrifying, which says something about either his temperament or about the particular mercy of losing consciousness before things get truly terrible. What he could not describe, because he was unconscious for it, was what those 15 seconds looked like from the other side of the glass. The engineers watching the instruments saw the pressure reading drop. They saw him go down. They started the repressurization sequence. And then they waited because there was nothing else to do. The chamber had to repressurize at a controlled rate, or they would cause other problems. So they watched the numbers and they waited, and they did not know yet whether the person on the floor of the chamber was going to get up. He got up. The people who designed spacesuits now know his name. His 15 seconds are in the training materials, the briefings, the design reviews. Every suit that goes into space carries the memory of what happened in that test chamber in 1966. Every redundant system, and every backup valve, and every protocol for emergency repressurization exists partly because of what a hose failure taught a room full of engineers about how little time there actually is. The suits that the Artemis II crew wore around the moon in April 2026 were new designs. Better than the EMU in almost every measurable way. More flexible. Better pressure management. Better communications. Designed for the radiation environment and the thermal extremes of deep space rather than the relatively sheltered environment of low Earth orbit. The program that produced them was laden over budget and controversial, and the suits that resulted from it were tested more extensively than any suits in NASA history. Because everyone involved understood what the alternative looked like. They understood because of LeBlanc. Because of Parmitano floating blind and deaf toward an airlock he could barely find. Because of the accumulated record of everything that had gone wrong and almost gone wrong and nearly gone wrong in half a century of putting human beings into suits and sending them outside. The suit is the last line. Everything else, the vehicle, the mission plan, the abort procedures, the training, all of it is designed to make sure the suit never has to be the last line. But space does not always cooperate with mission plans, and hoses come loose and filters clog, and the vacuum is always there, on the other side of whatever is between you and it, patient in the way that things are patient when they do not have to try. 15 seconds. That is the number. That is what Jim LeBlanc taught the people who send humans into space, in a test chamber in Houston on a Tuesday in 1966, by going down and getting back up. Everything built since then has been built around that number. Every redundancy, every backup, every protocol that exists for every possible failure mode in every suit that has ever left the atmosphere. 15 seconds is not very long. It is long enough if everything works right. So far it always has. But space is very large, and there are a lot of Tuesdays still to come.